What if death was not the end? What if one life could bleed into another, dragging with it memories of crimes, betrayals, and secrets no one was ever supposed to remember? In a quiet, rain-soaked corner of Europe, the year was 1809. A girl, barely in her teens, wrote words that were not her own, words describing murders she could not have witnessed and places she could never have seen. Her family hid the pages, terrified. Her village whispered possession. Her priest whispered blasphemy. And yet, her words lined up with truths buried in history. Why was her diary locked away for more than a century? Why were those who spoke about it silenced? Tonight, we open the book they wanted you to forget, and once you hear what she wrote, you will never think of death the same way again. In 1809, the world stood at a strange crossroads between the age of enlightenment and the shadows of superstition that still ruled rural life. Great cities were pulsing with new ideas, sciences, and revolutions, but the countryside, where most people lived, remained tied to centuries of belief in curses, omens, and hidden forces. In England, industrial progress was reshaping society, but in the smaller towns and villages, especially those far from London, the old ways endured. It was a world where a single rumor of witchcraft could still destroy a reputation, where strange dreams might be treated as divine warnings, and where the clergy held enormous power not only over faith, but over daily thought itself. To be born in such a place meant to live constantly under the eyes of neighbors, to have your every word and action judged, and to know that silence was sometimes safer than speaking truth. Within this setting, the discovery of a diary written by a girl named Eleanor Whitcomb becomes something far more than just a curiosity. A diary in those days was not common for children, especially not for girls from working-class families. Writing required education, paper, ink, luxuries that not every household could afford or justify. For a young girl to not only write, but to fill page after page with detailed accounts of lives lived long before her time, already marked her as extraordinary. The year 1809, marked on the inside of the diary, pins her existence to a moment of uncertainty in England's own history. The Napoleonic Wars were raging across Europe, and Britain lived in constant fear of invasion. Food was scarce, rumors were plenty, and the hardships of daily life drove people to cling even more desperately to explanations rooted in God, fate, or the devil. In this context, the notion of a child claiming she had lived through different lives would not be received with fascination, but with terror. Ideas of reincarnation were foreign and even dangerous. The Church condemned such beliefs as heresy. Those who entertained them risked being cast out, shunned, or worse. And yet Eleanor not only entertained these ideas, she committed them to writing, leaving behind a record that would one day disturb everyone who read it. The fact that her diary survived it all is remarkable, given how easily it could have been destroyed in fire or discarded as the scribblings of a troubled mind. Its survival hints at both fear and awe. Someone must have believed it was too important to erase, even if they were too afraid to let others see it. The year itself, 1809, carries a weight of timing. It is just far enough back in history that we cannot demand clear explanations, yet recent enough that documents, parish records, and court proceedings can sometimes confirm or challenge details of her writing. It sits in that liminal zone between the ancient and the modern, when the supernatural was not yet banished from respectable conversation. Doctors still carried amulets against unseen forces, and parish priests often doubled as exorcists. For a girl like Eleanor, the climate of her time created a prison around her words. She could not confess them to the priest without being accused of possession. She could not share them with friends without being whispered about as a witch. And so the diary became her only safe place, the one outlet for thoughts too dangerous to voice aloud. Rural England in that era was also deeply stratified. Families like the Whitcombs, tied to trades such as milling, lived with modest means. Their children had duties, chores, field work, weaving, helping parents keep the household afloat. A girl's future was usually predetermined: marriage, motherhood, and quiet labor. Dreams, ambitions, or any signs of rebellion were often suppressed. Eleanor's choice to write, and to write not about romances or girlish fantasies but about death, memory, and lives lived centuries apart set her apart as an anomaly. That anomaly would have been threatening, not only to her family but to the very structure of her society. A child who remembered the past too vividly could upset the present order, but the year 1809 also brought with it an unusual hunger for stories of the uncanny. Across Britain, pamphlets and penny broadsheets carried tales of hauntings, crimes, and supernatural visitations. In drawing rooms, gentlemen might discuss ghosts with the same seriousness they applied to politics. The public imagination was primed to be stirred by mysteries. Yet what Eleanor wrote was not entertainment. It was not designed for public eyes. It carried the raw terror of experience, a sense of truth written in secret, away from the marketplace of stories. And that difference is what made her diary so dangerous. It is also worth remembering how fragile a young life was in that period. Childhood illnesses killed many before they reached adulthood. Death surrounded children from their earliest days, shaping their imaginations and their fears. For Eleanor to speak so casually about death, and about her own death yet to come, would not have seemed playful or poetic to her family. It would have seemed like a curse. The date written inside her diary, 1809, also marks the year of her own death, making her words even more chilling. To place that context around her writing, that she was alive, trembling with visions, yet already preparing for her end, gives us a glimpse into the weight carried by those pages. When historians later uncovered the diary, the fact that it was dated to 1809 was crucial. It tied her words to a moment we can place in broader history. It allowed researchers to cross-reference her claims with actual parish death records in England and France, with merchant logs and court cases. Without that year, her writings might have been dismissed as pure invention. With it, they became a puzzle that demanded investigation. The year anchors her voice in time, giving her both credibility and tragedy. To understand Eleanor, one must understand the world into which she was born, a world where silence could mean survival, where words carried immense danger, and where history itself was a cage holding countless forgotten lives. The year 1809 is not just a number on a page. It is the key to why her diary mattered, why it was hidden, and why it resurfaced. It tells us that she lived at the edge of an old world, crumbling into a new one, and that somehow she captured in ink the very thing that both worlds feared the most. The possibility that death was not the end, and that the past could return, alive, through the fragile hands of a girl who should never have remembered it. The girl at the center of this mystery was not born into privilege, nor destined for fame. Her name, Eleanor Whitcomb, would have been lost entirely to time had her writings not surfaced long after her death. She lived in the quiet isolation of Northamptonshire, a countryside world of cobbled lanes, stone cottages, and farmlands marked by the endless rhythm of seasons. To those around her, Eleanor was simply a miller's daughter, a pale and quiet child who spent long hours gazing into the distance as if listening to voices only she could hear. From the outside, she might have seemed shy, perhaps fragile, even withdrawn. Yet within her, there burned a mind too restless to remain within the narrow confines of her small village life. Eleanor was born in 1795, the third of 5 children, to a family whose modest livelihood depended on grinding grain for the surrounding farms. Life for her was supposed to be simple: rise with the dawn, assist her mother with housework, tend to the younger siblings, and help her father when needed. In such families, children had little time for imagination. Survival demanded constant labor. But from an early age, Eleanor showed signs that something about her was different. She spoke in strange fragments, muttering about places she could not possibly have seen. She once described the bustling harbor of a French port in startling detail: ships docking, merchants shouting, though she had never stepped outside her village, let alone crossed the channel. When her father scolded her for lying, she insisted she had been there, not in this life, but before. It was not unusual for children to dream vividly, but Eleanor's descriptions unsettled those around her. She spoke of events with the certainty of memory, not the whimsy of invention. When asked how she knew these things, she gave the same quiet answer: because I was there. For her family, this explanation was unacceptable. It clashed with everything they believed, with everything the church had taught them. Yet Eleanor did not stop. As she grew older, her words took on a darker edge. She described not only places and people, but deaths, her own deaths, lived in other lives, each ending in fear and violence. To understand Eleanor is to realize how dangerous her voice was in 1809. Girls of her age were expected to be silent, obedient, and dutiful. Her thoughts and feelings were not meant for the wider world. But Eleanor had no outlet except her diary, a small book she began filling when she was 13. It was an ordinary object transformed into something terrifying. In its pages she poured out her recollections of being Marjorie Hale in Bristol, drowned in 1721, of being Juliette Moreau in France, executed in 1764. The diary reads not as fiction, but as testimony, detailed, sensory, haunted by pain. She wrote of the sound of fire consuming wood as though she stood in it, of the pressure of water in her lungs as though she drowned again while her hand guided the quill. These were not childish imaginings. They were confessions of memory. The central character here, Eleanor Whitcomb, must be understood not only as a child, but as a vessel of contradictions. On one hand, she was an ordinary girl bound by the strictures of her time. On the other, she carried within her a knowledge that stretched beyond centuries, beyond even her own body. Such knowledge made her dangerous. In her small village, whispers of witchcraft could end lives. A girl claiming to remember past existences risked being seen as possessed, cursed, or insane. And yet, despite the risk, she could not stop writing. Each entry seemed less like a choice and more like a compulsion, as if her hand was guided by a force outside herself. Her family, at first bewildered, soon grew frightened. Her father, Thomas Whitcomb, was a practical man who believed in hard work and silence. He wanted nothing to do with the strange ramblings of his daughter's pen. To him, they were shameful, even dangerous, a stain on the family's reputation. But her mother, Margaret, was torn between fear and pity. She saw, in Eleanor's pale face and distant eyes, a suffering that went beyond ordinary imagination. She could not understand her daughter's words, but she could not dismiss the sincerity with which they were written. The villagers noticed Eleanor's strangeness. Children whispered that she knew secrets no one had told her. Once, during a funeral, she described the manner of the dead man's passing with such eerie accuracy that his widow fainted. Another time she warned of a coming storm the day before it struck, destroying several crops. To some, these moments marked her as cursed. To others, they stirred unease, for if her words were true, then death itself was not what the church said it was. Her presence became both feared and pitied, a shadow that unsettled the ordinary rhythm of village life, and yet Eleanor herself seemed resigned. She did not boast of her memories, nor did she claim them with pride. She wrote them down with a kind of quiet sorrow, as if burdened by truths too heavy for her young shoulders. In one chilling entry, she admitted, "I do not wish to remember, but the remembering does not ask my leave." These words capture the essence of who she was, not a liar seeking attention, but a girl trapped in a cycle she could neither explain nor escape. Eleanor's fragility only heightened the sense of doom surrounding her. She was often ill, weakened by coughs and fevers that kept her confined to her bed. Her slight frame and pale complexion gave her the appearance of someone already half claimed by the grave. To those around her, this fragility became linked with her strange words. Perhaps, they whispered, she was not meant for this life. Perhaps she belonged more to the dead she remembered than to the living family who cared for her. As the diary continued, Eleanor's words grew darker. She began to predict her own death, writing with eerie certainty that she would not live beyond the age of 14. She described the manner of her passing with terrifying clarity, a suffocation, a drowning without water, a death that echoed the ones she remembered before. Her family grew desperate. Her father threatened to burn the diary, but Eleanor only began again, filling new pages with the same accounts, the same details, as if memory itself could not be erased. The central character of this story is not merely a child with strange thoughts, but a symbol of everything that society feared in that time. She stood at the intersection of innocence and forbidden knowledge, of fragility and defiance. In her, the past seemed alive again, and with it came questions her world was not ready to ask. What if death did not end a life? What if memories carried forward, demanding to be written, no matter the cost? Eleanor Whitcomb, the girl who claimed to live 3 different lives, forces us to confront these questions even now, her voice reaching across centuries through the fragile, faded ink of her secret diary. The diary itself, the object at the center of this unsettling tale, was not discovered in Eleanor Whitcomb's lifetime, but decades later, when time and decay had already begun to erase the traces of her existence. It emerged not through careful preservation, but through accident, as if fate itself had chosen the moment to allow its words to be seen again. In the late 19th century, long after Eleanor's death, a farmhouse in Northamptonshire was being prepared for sale. Workers tasked with clearing the property pried open a rotting floorboard, uncovering a small chest sealed with rusted iron clasps. Inside were ordinary remnants of a life once lived: faded fabric scraps, a broken rosary, and beneath them, the diary. At first glance, it was no more than a tattered notebook, its leather binding cracked with age, its pages swollen and curled from damp. But those who opened it sensed at once that this was no ordinary journal. The handwriting, delicate yet insistent, marched across the pages with an urgency that suggested compulsion rather than leisure. The opening line, in ink that had faded to a reddish brown, read with eerie clarity, "This is not my first life. I have died twice already. I remember everything." For the men who first read those words, the effect was immediate and unsettling. Diaries of girls in that era typically contained prayers, household observations, or trivial thoughts about family and seasons. This one spoke of death, memory, and repetition. The diary's rediscovery did not lead to immediate public revelation. Instead, it was quietly passed into the hands of a local antiquarian who collected manuscripts from the region. He recognized its strangeness, but he also recognized its danger. In Victorian England, as in Eleanor's own time, belief in spiritualism and the afterlife existed in tension with the firm grip of the Church. Publicly discussing reincarnation could invite ridicule or censure. And yet, within drawing rooms and private circles, tales of past lives and psychic visions circulated freely. The antiquarian copied portions of the diary and filed them among his other papers while the original remained tucked away, rarely seen except by a few curious scholars. The contents, when examined in full, only deepened the mystery. Eleanor's handwriting shifted subtly over the years of her short life, growing shakier, less steady, but the words themselves carried a consistency that made them chilling. She did not write as a girl recording dreams. She wrote as a witness compelled to testify. Each of her supposed past lives was laid out in unnerving detail: names, places, dates, sensations of death described with such immediacy that readers found themselves shuddering at the imagery. The diary spoke of Marjorie Hale in 1721, her drowning, and the hands that forced her under; of Juliette Moreau in 1764, her trial and execution, the fire consuming her lungs. These were not vague impressions. They were accounts. And when researchers cross-referenced the names and dates, they discovered echoes of truth. Both Marjorie and Juliette had indeed lived and died, their deaths recorded in obscure parish records, in 2 different countries. The discovery raised impossible questions. How could a miller's daughter in rural England, born in 1795 and dead by 1809, have known of a French seamstress executed decades earlier? How could she have described the name of a merchant who vanished from Bristol at the same time Marjorie Hale was found dead? Such knowledge was not accessible to children of her class. Newspapers rarely carried such details, and foreign archives were entirely out of reach. To those who examined the diary, 2 possibilities emerged. Either Eleanor was touched by madness of a most peculiar kind, or she truly carried within her the burden of memories not her own. The diary also contained more than accounts of death. Scattered between these recollections were passages of deep fear, of loneliness, and of resignation. Eleanor wrote of the burden of remembering, of the horror of reliving pain she had not chosen. She described the nights when dreams consumed her, dragging her through fire and water until she woke in a cold sweat, her hands shaking too violently to hold a spoon at breakfast. She wrote of her family's confusion, of her father's anger, of her mother's frightened pity. She confessed that writing was the only way she could endure it. If she put the memories on paper, she explained, perhaps they would leave her. For a while, the physical nature of the diary only added to its aura. Margins were crowded with hurried notations, as though thoughts pressed against her mind faster than her hand could move. Some entries ended mid-sentence, ink blotted, as if she had been interrupted, or overcome by the weight of what she recalled. Pages smelled faintly of smoke and mildew, but in places the ink appeared darker, fresher, as though it had resisted time's decay. The final pages carried a desperate, almost prophetic tone, with Eleanor insisting that her death was near and that she would not live past 14. Her last entry, written in a hand weak and faltering, ended with the words, "If you read this, I am already gone, but I will write again." What makes the diary's discovery so haunting is not only its contents, but the deliberate act of concealment. Someone in Eleanor's household, likely her parents, had locked it away after her death. The choice to hide it beneath the floorboards speaks volumes. They did not destroy it, as many might have done out of fear. Instead, they preserved it, intentionally sealing it away as though they knew it carried weight too great to erase. Perhaps they hoped it would never be found. Perhaps they believed it would one day matter. The silence surrounding its concealment is as chilling as the words themselves. Once uncovered, the diary began to circulate among those fascinated by the occult and the unexplained. Mediums, spiritualists, and scholars all read it with a mixture of awe and dread. Some declared it proof of reincarnation, a voice across lives that could not be ignored. Others dismissed it as the product of illness, perhaps epilepsy or hysteria, conditions poorly understood at the time. But none could explain away the uncanny accuracy of certain details. The debate has continued ever since, with historians, psychologists, and theologians each laying claim to their interpretation. Yet the diary remains more than just evidence for argument. To read it is to enter into the mind of a young girl trapped between worlds, condemned to remember what others forget. It forces the reader to ask questions they would rather avoid. What if memory does not die with the body? What if trauma carries forward, branded onto the soul itself? What if the boundary between lives is thinner than we believe? These are not comfortable questions, and perhaps that is why the diary was hidden for so long. The rediscovery of the diary turned Eleanor Whitcomb from a forgotten child into a haunting figure whose words echo across centuries. She became not simply a girl who died young, but a witness to something larger, something forbidden. Her diary is more than an artifact. It is a challenge, a voice from 1809 demanding to be heard, demanding that we look at death not as an ending, but as a door that may open again and again, no matter how much we wish it to remain closed. The lives Eleanor described within her diary were not vague or dreamlike. They were vivid, anchored in detail, and recounted with such authority that they felt less like inventions and more like testimonies pulled from memory. Each life, she claimed, to have lived carried its own tragedy, and together they formed a pattern that suggested she was bound to cycles of violence, injustice, and early death. To read her words is to sense that she did not choose what she remembered. Instead, she seemed compelled, as though her very being was haunted by experiences that clung to her soul long after the body that first endured them had crumbled to dust. The first life she spoke of belonged to Marjorie Hale, a woman from Bristol, who lived in the early 1700s. Eleanor described her in startling intimacy, not as a distant figure but as herself. She wrote of Marjorie's home near the docks, of the smell of salt and fish that clung to the air, and of the rough cobblestones that bruised her feet when she walked to market. She described the man she loved, a merchant who promised her a future of security but who instead became her destroyer. The diary recounts Marjorie's death in unflinching detail, how she was pushed down into a well, how icy water rushed into her lungs, how the world grew dim as hands held her beneath the surface. Eleanor wrote of the terror, the betrayal, and then the silence. What unsettled those who later read her account was the precision with which she named her killer, a merchant whose sudden disappearance was noted in Bristol records after a woman's suspicious drowning in 1721. There was no way Eleanor, a child in rural England, could have had access to such information. The second life carried her across the Channel to a French village in 1764. There she claimed she was Juliette Moreau, a seamstress who made her living mending clothes for wealthier families. Juliette's life, as Eleanor described it, was marked by loneliness and poverty. Yet she was not entirely powerless. She had a gift, an ability to sense storms before they came, floods before they struck. In a year of torrential rain, she warned her neighbors to protect their fields. When the river overflowed and destroyed crops, many believed her foresight was evidence of sorcery. Fear turned to accusation, accusation to trial. Eleanor's words captured Juliette's horror at being condemned as a witch. She described the cold stone cell where she waited, the jeers of the villagers who once bought her stitching, the terror as flames licked at the pyre. She wrote with chilling clarity about the sensation of burning, not only pain but the suffocating smoke, the dizziness, the way screams dissolved into silence. Parish archives confirm that in 1764 a woman named Juliette Moreau was executed. For witchcraft in that region, her death reduced to a line in a ledger. Eleanor's account, however, restores the agony that ledger cannot hold. Her third life was her own, and in writing it she seemed to recognize the pattern that bound her. Eleanor described herself as a prisoner of recurrence, forced to endure deaths that echoed the suffering she had already lived. She predicted her own end with terrifying confidence, writing that she would not survive past 14. She described what awaited her. Not fire, not drowning, but suffocation. A closing of the throat and lungs as if her body remembered the past too well to escape it. This final life was marked by fear, not only of death itself, but of the inevitability of it. She knew, or believed she knew, that her future was already written. What makes these lives so disturbing is not only their content, but their connection to one another. In each, Eleanor described betrayal, accusation, or violence at the hands of others. None of her deaths were natural, each was inflicted. It is as though she carried within her a wound that could never heal, one that followed her across centuries. And it is this cycle that gives her diary its dark power. The suggestion that injustice does not end with death, but imprints itself upon the soul, forcing its bearer to relive variations of the same tragedy again and again. Readers of the diary have noted the consistency of voice across the accounts. When Eleanor wrote as Marjorie or Juliet, the tone shifted slightly, reflecting differences in language and experience. Yet the core was always the same, a voice pleading to be heard, to be remembered, to not be erased. The transitions between lives were often marked by dreams. Eleanor described nights where she felt herself falling asleep as one person and waking as another, inhabiting bodies and moments not her own. She did not treat these dreams as fantasy. For her, they were proof that the barrier between life and death was thin, permeable, and that she had crossed it more than once. The accuracy of certain details remains the most haunting element. Marjorie's drowning was a case whispered about, but never solved. The merchant Eleanor named existed, though his fate was never documented. Juliette Moreau's execution was a matter of record, but her name would not have been known to a rural English girl decades later. Eleanor's knowledge defies explanation. Historians who examined the diary after its discovery wrestled with the possibility of coincidence, but the weight of specificity pressed against that conclusion. For believers in the supernatural, her diary became a chilling affirmation of reincarnation, of memory carried through death. For skeptics, it remained a troubling riddle, perhaps the product of illness, yet too precise to dismiss outright. What strikes the reader most, however, is not the evidence, but the emotion. Eleanor did not write like someone fabricating tales. She wrote with anguish, with exhaustion, with the weariness of a soul too old for her young body. Her words reveal a child who felt doomed to repeat horrors she did not deserve. A child who carried centuries of suffering in her thin, trembling hands. The lives she described were not myths to her. They were her identity, her truth. And whether or not one believes in their reality, the fact remains that Eleanor lived and died under the shadow of those memories, unable to separate herself from them. To study her diary is to step into a labyrinth of memory and death, one in which the lines between past and present blur until they are indistinguishable. Marjorie drowned, Juliet burned, Eleanor suffocated. Each life ended in violence. Each life was hidden, silenced, reduced to whispers or records. But through Eleanor's hand, through her desperate compulsion to write, those lives spoke again, carrying their pain forward into the fragile form of a girl in 1809. And it is in that compulsion that the true horror lies, not only that she remembered, but that she could not stop remembering. As if the weight of injustice demanded to be carried across lifetimes until someone finally listened. She began to write about the city as if it were breathing, a thing alive, whispering to her through its stone walls and cobblestone streets. The diary shifted from being a record of her personal thoughts to something stranger, more unsettling. She would describe events that had not yet taken place. A fire breaking out near the docks, a man found drowned in the canal, an argument that escalated into violence inside a tavern. Days later, when townspeople would speak of these very things as news, the eerie precision of her writings could no longer be brushed aside as coincidence. Yet she made no claims of prophecy. Instead, she described them as memories, moments she believed she had already lived through in one of her other lives. Her words painted a chilling picture. Perhaps reality was not as linear as most believed, but a loop, an echo of experiences reverberating through her mind. The diary also began to describe her encounters with people she swore she had met before, though they did not recognize her. She would recall the color of a man's coat, the scar above a woman's lip, the precise turn of phrase a merchant would use to haggle, long before any of these things happened in her presence. When she later confronted them with details only, they should know. Childhood fears, secret illnesses, betrayals whispered behind closed doors. Their reactions ranged from terror to outrage. Some called her cursed, others accused her of witchcraft. In a time when the church's shadow lingered heavily over daily life, the notion of a young woman possessing knowledge beyond her years was dangerous, perhaps deadly. She seemed to understand this danger and wrote of it often, noting that she felt hunted by those who feared what she knew. The pages became frantic with warnings to herself. Trust no one. They will come for me. They will not let me keep this secret. It was not only the present and future she seemed to relive, but the distant past as well. Her words described places she had never visited, wars she had not lived through, and monarchs whose reigns had ended long before her birth. She wrote with authority of the year 1746, speaking of the Jacobite rebellion in Scotland, as though she had marched with the soldiers and tasted the bitterness of defeat. In another passage, she described the siege of a French city with such specificity that historians who later examined her writing were unnerved by its accuracy. She claimed she had stood among the women who carried buckets of water to extinguish fires from falling shells. She spoke of faces blackened with soot, of prayers muttered into rags pressed against mouths, of children clutching dolls with melted waxen faces. Yet in 1809, she could not have been more than a young girl, barely at the edge of adulthood, and had no access to such detailed accounts. The diary made it clear she was not imagining these lives. She believed she had lived them. As her writing deepened, the tone darkened. She began to question who or what was guiding her through these overlapping identities. She described dreams in which she walked through corridors filled with doors, each marked by a different year. When she opened one, she would step into a life already in progress, wearing the body of a woman she did not recognize, feeling the weight of a history that was not her own. At times she claimed she could not tell where one life ended and another began. A scar on her hand in one existence would ache in her current body, though there was no mark upon her skin. The grief of losing a child in a century-long past would leave her weeping inconsolably in her bed, unable to explain her sorrow to anyone who asked. The diary reveals a mind collapsing under the weight of too many memories, as though reality itself was thinning around her. But perhaps the most chilling element was her account of a voice. She wrote that, late at night, when she sat alone with Tulazi, her candle flickering low, she would hear someone whispering over her shoulder. The words were not always clear, but she knew the presence. It spoke of things she should not write, things she must not reveal. The voice warned her that remembering too much would unravel the fragile balance between her lives. Sometimes it commanded her to burn the pages, to erase the evidence of her knowledge. She resisted at first, but more than once she admitted in her diary that she had torn out sheets and consigned them to the fire, unable to defy the oppressive weight of the unseen force that guided her hand. She feared the voice, yet also seemed tethered to it, as if it alone understood what she endured. In her isolation, it became both her tormentor and her confidant. The entries grew increasingly fragmented as time passed. Some pages were filled with only single words repeated over and over. Remember, return, awake. Others contained passages written backward, as though she had been compelled to disguise her thoughts. Her handwriting would shift mid-page, sometimes elegant and precise, other times jagged and nearly illegible, as though different versions of herself fought for control of the pen. Scholars who later examined the diary debated whether this was evidence of dissociation, possession, or something far stranger. The girl herself, however, seemed to accept it as the natural consequence of her divided existence. She would apologize to herself in writing, acknowledging that she could no longer tell which thoughts belonged to which life. It is here that the diary becomes a chilling mirror, reflecting the fears of a society that had little tolerance for women who did not fit within prescribed roles. A girl who wrote with such unsettling insight into events past and future, who claimed to straddle multiple lives, was not merely eccentric, she was dangerous. Her words threatened the neat order of time, of faith, of social hierarchy. The whispers of witchcraft, already dangerous in previous generations, could still ignite violence in small towns and villages. She herself seemed to anticipate her end, scribbling in one of the final legible passages, "If they find me, they will call me mad. If they cannot silence me, they will kill me. But I cannot stop. The lives will not let me stop." It is a line that has haunted every scholar, historian, and investigator who has ever dared to read her words. By 1809, the diary had ceased abruptly. There is no final entry, no neat conclusion, only the sudden silence of unfinished thoughts. Some speculate the rest of the pages were destroyed, either by her own hand or by others determined to conceal her secret. Others believe the diary we possess today is but a fragment of a much larger work, scattered and hidden through time, perhaps still waiting to be unearthed. What remains, however, is enough to cast doubt upon the very structure of history itself. Was this the work of a disturbed mind? Or was it the testimony of someone who had lived through the folds of time, a girl forced to carry the unbearable weight of 3 different lives in one fragile body? The discovery of the diary in 1809 did not occur in the daylight of careful scholarship, but in the half-whispered murmur of scandal. It was said that the book was found hidden beneath a loose board in the floor of her room after she vanished. The diary itself was small, bound in worn leather, its cover cracked as though it had been handled by hands far older than hers. Dust clung to its surface, and the ink of its pages had bled in places, as if damp had touched it at some point during its concealment. Yet what unnerved those who found it was not merely the strange words within, but the fact that some entries appeared to be written in different inks, with different levels of age to them, as if portions had been penned years before she was even born. The dates at the top of certain entries, 1746, 1762, 1791, suggested a hand that belonged not to a girl in her teens, but to someone who had walked through multiple decades. This detail became the fuel for rumor. Was she the sole author? Or had she inherited a journal begun by others who claimed the same affliction? Or was it, as some darkly suggested, the work of one entity that stretched itself across time? Those who examined the diary in the immediate aftermath of its discovery were unsettled by its shifting voice. Some entries were written with the tremulous hand of a child, uncertain, looping letters that betrayed youth and inexperience. Others carried a bold, almost masculine authority, with sharp, clean strokes and a confident tone. In one section, she wrote with a French accent, her words tinged with phrases that betrayed a foreign tongue. In another, she recorded details of English villages with such intimacy it was as though she had lived among them. The inconsistency disturbed her family and the clergyman who was called to judge its contents. To them, the diary seemed less like the record of a troubled girl and more like a confession of sorcery. They whispered of possession, of a spirit that had taken hold of her, forcing her to channel its words onto the page. What elevated the diary from curiosity to danger, however, was its disturbing accuracy regarding local events. Within its pages were not only recollections of battles fought decades before, but details of deaths and crimes that had unfolded in their very parish. She described, for instance, a woman found hanged from the rafters of her cottage weeks before the tragedy actually occurred. She spoke of a man who would be crushed beneath a falling beam at the mill, describing his final cry with unnerving specificity. When these events came to pass, the townsfolk could no longer ignore the book's sinister weight. For some, it was proof that she was a vessel of evil, predicting doom upon her neighbors. For others, it was evidence that she was cursed with visions too dark to bear. Either way, the diary had become a dangerous object, one that could not remain in the open. It is said the parish clergyman insisted the book be destroyed, yet no one dared to burn it. Those who handled it claimed they felt a coldness through the leather, as though it retained the chill of a grave. One man who attempted to tear a page from its spine found his hands shaking so violently that he could not hold a pen for weeks thereafter. Fear spread that the book itself carried some contagion of the soul, capable of unsettling even the most steadfast. And so, instead of burning it, they hid it. First in the church cellar, then in the home of a local magistrate, then, after strange noises were reported within those walls, in the library of a distant estate where it was locked in a chest and forgotten. Each transfer of the diary was marked by unease, as if those who passed it on were eager to rid themselves of its burden, but fearful of being cursed for doing so. The most unsettling passages came from what scholars later called the mirror entries. In these, she wrote as though she were aware that someone in the future would be reading her words. She addressed her reader directly, warning them to stop, to close the book, to bury it deeper than before. "You are not safe with me," one entry declared. "The more you know, the more you remember. And when you remember, they will find you." Who they were was never clarified, but the ambiguity made it all the more terrifying. Some believed she meant the church authorities who would brand her a witch. Others claimed she spoke of shadowy figures who moved across centuries, hunting those who strayed too close to forbidden knowledge. A few even whispered that she referred to herself. Other versions of her, drawn from other lives, seeking to silence the one voice that had dared to write their secrets down. The language of the diary was not always coherent. At times it descended into feverish raving, with words scratched so deeply into the paper that they nearly tore through. In other places, symbols appeared, strange sigils that no scholar could definitively identify, though some bore resemblance to alchemical signs or early occult markings. There were circles with intersecting lines, eyes drawn repeatedly along margins, and sequences of numbers that scholars debated might represent dates, codes, or something far more cryptic. These markings gave the diary the quality of a ciphered text, as though she had hidden her truths behind a veil of madness, daring only the most persistent to unlock them. What unsettles historians most is how the diary seems to anticipate its own discovery. One passage dated 1809 reads, "They will lift the floorboards, they will find me, but not all of me. I will be scattered, as I have always been." The entry appears to describe the very act of uncovering the book beneath her room, suggesting she knew in advance what would happen. Another line warns, "If they take me to the cellar, the voices will not rest. The walls will crack, the stones will moan, and they will move me again." Parish records from that very year described disturbances in the church cellar, sounds of knocking, reports of a faint sobbing at night, though no person was found within. Whether coincidence or not, the overlap between her words and the events that followed is undeniable. As the years passed, the diary gained a reputation not only as a relic of a troubled girl, but as an object of dread. By the time it resurfaced in the late 19th century, housed in a private collection, its reputation preceded it. Scholars debated whether it was a fraud, a deliberate fabrication meant to frighten. Yet those who examined the ink and paper found them authentic to their claimed time frames. The unsettling variety of handwriting was never fully explained. Some attributed it to mental illness, perhaps dissociative identities, though others argued that it was too sophisticated, too deliberate to be dismissed so easily. The diary straddled the line between history and legend, fact and phantasm. What is clear is that the diary functioned as both record and curse. Those who read it too closely often claimed to dream of corridors filled with doors, just as she had described. A few even reported the sensation of slipping into another life, waking with vivid memories of places they had never been, languages they had never studied. The diary seemed to infect those who engaged with it, extending her burden across generations. And perhaps this was her true legacy, not merely the record of one girl who claimed to live 3 different lives, but a living contagion of memory, spilling across time, eroding the barriers between past, present, and future, until those who dared to read her words could no longer be certain which life was truly their own. By the time the diary's existence began circulating beyond the parish where it was first uncovered, it had already taken on the weight of myth. Some dismissed it as a forgery, a curiosity spun out of local superstition, while others swore that those who held it too long became changed, restless, pale, haunted by dreams that did not belong to them. What is striking is not only the content of the diary itself, but the way its reputation spread like a shadow, staining the lives of those who dared to study it. By the mid-19th century, a handful of scholars and antiquarians had gained access to fragments of its pages, and their accounts only deepened the sense that the girl's words reached beyond her own lifetime. Each described the same unease, that in reading her memories, they began to recall things they themselves had never lived. A historian from Edinburgh, after days spent copying the text, claimed he awoke one morning with the vivid recollection of fighting in a battle that took place decades before his birth. He recorded feeling the weight of a musket in his arms, the taste of gunpowder in his mouth, and the terror of charging across a field littered with corpses. He swore these visions were not dreams, but memories, bleeding into his mind through the words of the diary. The idea of memory as infection, that the diary was not merely a record, but a carrier of experience, began to circulate among those who studied it. This belief was strengthened by the fact that the diary itself seemed to adapt to its reader. Reports surfaced that certain entries appeared clearer to some than to others, as though the ink responded differently depending on who read it. A scholar of theology claimed he could see Latin phrases in the margins that were invisible to his colleague. An antiquarian insisted he found entire pages that were blank when shown to another man only hours later. This strange mutability made the diary impossible to catalog with certainty. No 2 descriptions of its content fully matched, which in turn fueled the suspicion that it was alive in some way, an artifact not bound by ink and paper, but something that reached into the reader's mind and rewrote what was seen. What frightened investigators most were the warnings buried throughout the text. Time and again, the girl cautioned that remembering too much was dangerous. She described the sensation of being watched by figures who moved just beyond the corner of her vision, figures she could never quite face. These presences, she said, grew stronger whenever she wrote of her past lives. She hinted that they were guardians of time, or perhaps hunters, tasked with silencing those who strayed too far outside the bounds of their own existence. Her words suggested that history itself was policed, and that anyone who carried too many memories of lives not their own risked drawing attention from these watchers. Readers of the diary often found themselves glancing over their shoulders, compelled by the uncanny feeling that they too had attracted the gaze of something unseen. Over the decades, the diary's reputation became intertwined with a string of misfortunes. A collector in London who purchased it at auction was found dead in his study, the diary open before him, his face twisted into an expression of terror. His family insisted he had been in good health, yet the coroner attributed the death to sudden heart failure. Another scholar, a woman who had written extensively on folklore and superstition, disappeared without explanation after announcing she had discovered a hidden pattern in the diary's dates. Her last known letter contained a single cryptic line: "The doors are opening again, and I must see where they lead." Neither she nor her notes were ever found. Such stories ensured that the diary was never treated as an ordinary artifact. It carried with it a sense of risk, as though merely touching it might alter the trajectory of a person's life. What continues to disturb researchers is how the diary undermines the very foundations of history. If the girl truly lived multiple lives, her words suggest that time is not linear but layered, folding back upon itself like the pages of a book. The possibility that events could be recalled before they occurred, or remembered in ways that defied chronology, threatened the authority of historical record. Some speculated that the diary might be evidence of reincarnation, though its descriptions went beyond simple rebirth. She did not describe dying and being born anew, but inhabiting lives simultaneously, as though her consciousness were fragmented across centuries. Others argued it hinted at something darker, that memory itself was not private but collective, a vast reservoir that certain individuals could access at great cost. In this view, the girl was not cursed but gifted, or cursed because she was gifted, with the ability to breach the walls of time and tap into an archive of human experience that most were mercifully barred from. The psychological implications were equally troubling. If memory could be shared, even unwillingly, then identity itself was fragile. Who was she truly? The girl in 1809, or the soldier at Culloden, or the woman at a French siege? Could a person's self be dissolved entirely if too many memories from too many lives flooded in? Her later diary entries suggest she feared precisely this fate. She wrote of moments when she could not remember her own name, when the reflection in her mirror seemed that of a stranger. She recorded times when her voice shifted mid-sentence, or when her hand signed a name that did not belong to her. This collapse of identity is perhaps the most terrifying possibility the diary reveals, that the boundaries of self are not fixed, and that to trespass too deeply into memory is to risk becoming no one at all. Even now, in the 21st century, whispers of the diary persist. It is said to reside in a private collection, inaccessible to the public, though rumors surface occasionally of photographs or transcriptions that circulate in secret. Those who claim to have glimpsed its pages online report similar effects to those of the past: vivid dreams, intrusive memories, the disorienting sense of déjà vu stretching beyond anything ordinary. Whether these accounts are exaggerations or evidence of something real is impossible to say. What is certain is that the diary remains a source of dread fascination. It is not just a historical curiosity, but a challenge to the way we understand time, memory, and the limits of human experience. In the end, what makes the diary so disturbing is not only the content of the girl's writings, but the way they seem to reach out and entangle anyone who comes too close. Her warnings were not simply for herself. They echo across the centuries, cautioning every reader that memory is not a harmless thing. To remember is to risk being remembered in turn, to call attention from forces that thrive in the unseen margins of history. Perhaps this is why the diary was hidden, why its pages were torn and burned, why those who encountered it tried so desperately to rid themselves of it. Not because it was madness on paper, but because it might have been the truth, and the truth in this case is something no one was ever meant to survive. If you've stayed with us through this haunting journey into the diary of a girl who claimed to live 3 different lives, then you already know this is not just a story. It's a question that challenges everything we believe about memory, time, and identity. Was she a cursed child, a vessel of forbidden knowledge, or a witness to something so vast and unsettling that history itself tried to erase her? The truth may never be certain, but what lingers is the unease, The whisper that perhaps we too are only one step away from remembering a life we were never supposed to live. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe her words were the unraveling of a troubled mind? Or do you think she truly carried memories of other lives across time? Could her diary be evidence of reincarnation, or something far darker, a glimpse into the fractures of reality itself? Your perspective matters, and the comment section is where these mysteries take on a life of their own. Share your thoughts, your theories, even your doubts, because every idea brings us closer to understanding what may have been hidden for centuries. And if this story gripped you, if you felt that cold shiver, that pull into the unknown, then subscribe now. Join us as we uncover more forgotten truths, more suppressed histories, and more questions that were never meant to be asked. The next secret may already be waiting in the shadows, and you don't want to miss it.